Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender, where we take that deep dive into the most important economic issues facing agriculture. I'm your host, Carly Jacobson. We have David Widmar and Brent Gloy back with us from Agricultural Economic Insights, along with our own Jeff Steffensmeier to discuss some of those barriers to budgeting. So I feel comfortable going out on a limb to say here that we all likely recognize the value of budgeting, but it's often the struggle of creating one or maintaining one, or possibly even finding value in what you're uncovering through that budgeting. So while we don't plan to solve all the budgeting woes today, I am confident that you'll find some nuggets that will help you unlock some new potential in your budgeting process. Brent, you ready to kick us off?
You bet. Thanks, Carly. This week we're talking about allocating fixed expenses, and as you know, in farming, a lot of times we spend a lot of time thinking about costs, but one category of costs that I think we often ignore, or not necessarily ignore, but don't think about managing as much, are our fixed expenses. And one of the reasons is that fixed expenses are hard, especially things like equipment. It's hard to get a good estimate of what those costs are, as well as thinking about, well, how do I allocate those among different entities or different enterprises? So today, what we want to do, we did another webinar earlier on, trying to help you think about how to measure fixed costs. And today, what we want to do is talk about how to allocate them, as well as give you some good reasons why you really want to do this. And I know if you're like me, we hear all the time, farmers need to know their numbers, know their costs. And I often say farmers, I think, know them very well. And sometimes it feels a little bit like these signs here, what numbers are we talking about? Which way do we want to go with these numbers? What do I do with the numbers? Somebody's always telling me one thing or another. So we want to try and cut through a little bit of that confusion here in the next half hour with you. So as I think about knowing your costs, one of the things I think is really important is putting them in the right place and allocating them appropriately. And oftentimes I would say there's two categories of these. There's the ones that are the easy bucket, or the things that we can do pretty easily. Those are things like variable expenses, seed, fertilizer, herbicide. It's pretty obvious where which enterprise the corn seed should be charged to, right? The same with the fertilizer. If we put fertilizer on corn, we attribute that cost to the corn enterprise. If we put it on soybeans, we attribute it to the soybean enterprise. Those things are pretty easy. And consequently, I think that's where a lot of us spend a lot of our time worrying about those costs. But as I was saying, these fixed expenses usually account for somewhere around half of all of your total expenses. So it's really important to spend some time thinking about those expenses and how to allocate those to the enterprises. And these things can be a little bit trickier to think about allocating. For instance, something like family living expenses. Well, which enterprise should bear the costs of family living, and how much? Labor. Okay. Some of the labor is pretty easy to charge out if we keep really good records of where that labor is being used. Others may be a little bit harder. It's just what we often call an overhead expense. So machinery expense then being the last big one, then I think can be really important and a little bit tricky to allocate out. So in the next 20 minutes, that's what we're going to talk to you about, some ways to think about these and a way to get started with it. And we've come up with a 4-step process, or David came up with this, I think, from his cost accounting background, ways to get started. The first thing we need to do is identify which costs we need to allocate. So like I said, some of them are awfully easy. Corn seed, pretty obvious. The tractor that we use to plant corn and soybeans and maybe do some work with our cattle is a little bit harder, and we need to think about how to allocate it. Then we need to determine what is the question that we're trying to answer. I think this is a really important one. So are we trying to say, is our overall farm profitable? Or are we trying to say, I really wonder if I should increase the size of my beef herd or the size of my cropping operation? very different questions. And we want to be really careful when we're allocating costs, especially in that second question of which enterprise is more profitable, to make sure we have done the allocation correctly. So the third thing, we want to identify how to go about doing it. So we might start with something like, well, how many acres of crops do you have? So if you had 1,500 acres of corn and 1,500 acres of soybeans, we might split them on the basis of corn and soybeans acres and split them half and half. Head of livestock. We can also think about how much revenue each one of those enterprises generates, or how many hours, the item or you are spending with each one of those enterprises. So there's several ways to think about how to allocate it. And then fourth, once we do it, we want to think about the shortcomings, because I said this, coming from economists, you won't be surprised, but life is about making trade-off decisions. And with every one of these allocations, there's going to be some trade-offs. One might be easier, one might be harder, one might, give you better information, or less information might make one enterprise look better than the other. So we want to really understand the shortcomings of the approach we use.
Brent, thanks. That's really helpful to think about. As you work through these, there's never going to be a silver bullet. There's never going to be one answer that works for every scenario in your specific operation. So thinking about, just a combine, I know, Brent, we were talking about this beforehand, you have a lot of irrigated and dry land, right? So what's an appropriate way of thinking about harvest costs? There's the acre question, but an acre of harvesting is a lot more bushels on the irrigated than it is versus the dry land. And, I was thinking back to that college course of cost accounting. There are entire divisions of accountants in Fortune 500 companies who think about this on a regular daily basis. And I think that's how we maybe need to think about that as a producer, is when we're thinking about this allocation, we're putting on a different hat. It's a different role. It's not preparing our tax documents. It's really thinking about, and it's not what we do when we're trying to put together our crop budget for our loan renewals. It's this activity that we do that helps us inform all of these other decisions. So this is a unique role. So to think about this, we're going to set up a couple of examples before we get to our Q&A session with Jeff. And don't forget to submit your questions to the Q&A portal for that overtime. But the first example we have here is with Randy. And Randy has 3,000 acres of corn and soybeans, and it's $80,000 in family living expense. And so the question is, how does he allocate that? And this is a simple example. And the question we posed for you is, what would you recommend for Randy to think about for allocating? And I think most of us would come to option A, which is take the $80,000, divide it by 3,000, and just charge $27 per acre to both the corn and the soybean enterprises. Now, there's a lot that could go into this. You can make this a little more complicated, but it's about these trade-offs. I think most of us would probably see that this is a fine way of thinking about that in this example. Now, let's take it to one step further, right? Let's make it a little more complicated. And you can see how this quickly becomes very complicated, and why it's tempting for most of us to throw our hands up in the air when we're working on this. And so here's Penny, Randy's neighbor, and she has 3,000 acres of corn and soybeans, and now she has 75 cows. And if you think about it real quick, the cows aren't going to be a very big source of revenue generation for this operation. But she's trying to think about how to allocate $50,000 in shared equipment. So maybe it's that tractor or that skid steer or a combination of equipment that they use for both enterprises. And it's interesting, on one hand, we're trained in agriculture to spread our resources out. So it's really appealing in agriculture to use this tractor in multiple enterprises, but this creates this fixed expense allocation challenge. So how should we think about this? So I want to set up 4 possible options, and we're going to turn the poll on, and we want to get your input. And I'll tell you up front, there's no right or wrong answer, but we want to see how you might think about this. So option 1 is Penny puts all of that $50,000 on the crops. So puts it all in that crop budget. Option B is she puts it all in the cow budget. Option C is there's an allocation by how much revenue is generated. So it sort of takes the top line, how much economic activity is going on with the crops relative to the cow-calf, and then split the expense on that proportion. And finally, D using a log to keep track of how many hours are being used for these equipment. So I will say it was interesting as we were preparing for this, because I quickly thinking about Brent's trade-offs. I quickly was like, oh yeah, I would just do this because, I made some quick assumptions, right? And Brent was like, oh no, I would think about it this way. And Jeff came in. Jeff's like, oh man, no, you guys are both gonna. So it'll be interesting to see how the results come back in. All right, so the majority of you, 51%, talked about allocating it by hours used. You must be talking to Jeff. Jeff must be you must be following Jeff on Twitter or LinkedIn. Another big group of you said allocate by revenue generated of 47%. And then a small share of you had another option. So thanks for sharing that. As I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to break this down. I'm going to talk about why we might use one or why we might use the other. And of course, those 4 questions that we set up, maybe get to those shortcomings. So let's break this down a little bit. So I want to share a little bit of more details. I want to sort of give you a few more assumptions. If you pursue option A to 100% of the crops, that's going to come down to about $16 per acre. If you move them all to the cows, it's going to get to $667 per head. So it's a pretty big charge there. If you're going to do option C, allocate it by the revenue generated. I did a quick back of the envelope calculation. It's about a 90%, 10% split. So $15 an acre of the crops and 10% or $66 per head to the livestock. And then option D is hours used. Maybe we kept a log and we said, okay, 75% of the hours went for the crop activity. So that's $12.50 an acre. And then the 25% of that 50,000 is going to get charged to the livestock, which comes to $166 per head. So what we can see when we break these down is how we might start to get different signals, right? So I want to talk a little bit more about option A, right? But my brain quickly went to option A probably isn't all that bad of a choice, because $16 an acre, maybe I get down to 15 here, 12, I'm within $4 an acre on the crop side if I allocate that. But I want to show you how that might really mess up your thinking down the road.
Yeah, David, I think when I did it, I was thinking about revenue generation because that was probably pretty easy to do. Whereas the logbook is really a great way to do it if you're willing to put in the effort and do it. And sometimes it comes down to how important the expense is. And again, that back to that question you're trying to answer.
So let's take that one step further and let's talk about option A, the 100% to crops, $16 per acre, and let's work through those 4 questions. And my recommendation for all of you is to take those 4 questions and work it through all of the options that you're going to consider. So 1, identify each of the costs needing allocated. I was a little vague here. I think one of the pieces of advice is you have to be very specific. I just said equipment expense, right? In reality, it could be tractor with a front end loader plus a skid steer, right? So maybe you need to think about it a little bit differently for the different pieces of equipment. But we've identified its equipment. You can make it more specific in your own situation. Point 2, what is the question at hand? So the first question that you might be pursuing is, will the farm be profitable in 2021? I think this method will help transfer all that expense to the bottom line, and you're going to be able to answer this. But here's where this option A will really get you in trouble. Should I double my cow herd, right? We saw that option A is going to put 0 cost on that cow herd, when in reality, as you work to the bottom of those examples, C and D said somewhere between $60, maybe up to $160 per head of equipment expense needs to be going into that. So this is where you really have to think about what's the question that's relevant. The third element here is, what are the relevant metrics? Revenue generated, hours used. These are relevant for the question. In this example, maybe you could also think about acres covered, bushels harvested, bales of hay made. You can think about a lot of different ways that you can capture metrics to help allocate that. And finally, step 4, what are the shortcomings? Option A is going to be a pretty easy shortcut, but it'll probably work for you, especially if you're just trying to answer the profitability question. But if you want to answer the question, should I expand my cow-calf herd, it's going to really lead you astray. It's going to really bias those outputs to really make it look like it was, even as I was making this example, I was like, wow, $60 a head. That's a really big number to be off. And that could really skew your thinking as one, as you think about expanding, but two, what you might be willing to bid for additional pasture acres or even additional cows to add on. So you can really mess up your thinking down the road.
Right. And David, it's true too of allocating your managerial time as well. So it's, it's really important, I think, to start to get a good handle on where the profit really is in your operation. And for instance, if we made this example 600 or 550 cows and 3,000 acres, then the stakes are a lot higher, right?
Right. Yep. Very, very good point. So I'm going to start this up, and Brent will wrap it up in our last couple slides before we get Jeff on. But we want to put up some red flags, and these are these red flags that you're going to probably come across in your decision making. If you see these types of situations, this is where the allocation question starts to become more critical. So first off, the types of enterprises. If you have diverse enterprises, this allocation effort is going to be a little more challenging. So if you have livestock versus and crops, and you're sharing those that equipment or labor, you're going to have to think a little bit more about this allocation question. Also, on the irrigated versus non-irrigated, some of these irrigated acres take more management, take more passes with across the field, take more just more intensely managed and equipment to get that done. And the third example here is custom application. Maybe you're buying a little more capacity than you need, and you're helping some neighbors out and trying to generate a little bit of revenue. You got to make sure you know those costs. The second category of examples where you're going to think critically about this are shared fixed expenses. We've talked about this, but family living, labor, equipment, these are all examples of where this might be an expense that you have to think about the allocation. And finally, anytime you're trying to make critical management decisions, such as expanding the operation, identifying poor performance, or identifying success to leverage to move into the future, anytime you're asking those tough managerial questions, these are going to be the times we're going to have to think about this allocation question.
Yeah, I think you hit on the really important ones. And again, remember, we're talking about costs that can account for somewhere around half of all your total costs. So if we don't have them right, we can make some kind of screwy management decisions sometimes. And these come up all the time. I think about this a lot. Should you expand your irrigated operation or the non-irrigated operation? Well, if we don't really understand what those costs are and what the differences are, I think we can get ourselves into trouble. And the other thing, think about selling crop. If we underestimate, our fixed expenses of selling a crop, it's really hard to know what appropriate price is and what our price target should be. So at the end of the day, I think one of the things, and this is one of the things we try and preach a lot, is don't get stuck on what's the right way, and don't just put this in the too hard box and kind of ignore it, but create a process that works for you. And in some cases, it might be a simpler process. In other places, it might be worth investing in the more complicated process. And David will have a good example about that in a second. But learn from others, focus on the practices that you're using and test your thinking and use scenarios. So think about, as you allocate those costs out, do they look reasonable? Do they pass the smell test, I guess is what I would say. Use some different scenarios. And if we start to find that how we allocate really swings, our thinking a little bit, we want to dig in really deep and make sure that we're getting it right. The other thing is the significance and the relevance of the cost. Is the cost important, and how relevant is it? And I think, David, this is where you've got a good example.
Yeah, so I was reading an article a few months ago, and it said General Motors knows the cost of every lug nut that goes on one of their vehicles. And I kind of laughed to myself, and I was like, yeah, of course they would, because it's a variable expense, right? They have to pay for every pallet load of lug nuts they get. But then I just got to thinking about this just a little bit more. And for most of us, if we went out and had to buy 4 lug nuts for our hay wagon, we're just going to put that in some overhead expense, right? Repairs, and we're going to figure out some way of allocating it per head or per. And so it's probably not worth our time to get really caught up into, did I make sure these $8 worth of lug nuts got allocated to the livestock and they didn't get spilled over in the crops because they only use this, 80% of the time for crops and 20% for livestock. You can really confuse yourself over a few lug nuts. So don't get caught up into that. But on the other hand, right, think about how this is a different question. It's not that it's the lug nuts that are insignificant. It's how it's relevant to your operation. If you're a manufacturer of lug nuts, you have to know exactly how much it costs to make a lug nut, or you're going to be out of business very quickly. If you're General Motors, you better have a really good idea of what it costs, because that's a variable input. You got to make sure that you get those on your vehicles and that you can include that in the cost of your vehicle. Probably it's not going to bankrupt General Motors if they get it wrong, but they need to know it. And so we really have to think about the relevance and significance. And also, I'm going to steal the next point here from Brent. Keep in mind that you have to update and adapt your processes as your operation changes. In our example, we had 75 cows. If you had 550 cows, it's a very different decision, and the magnitude is very different. So if you're buying 4 lug nuts, you probably don't need to worry about it. If you're buying thousands of lug nuts for some reason, or thousands of fence posts, it starts to become a very significant part of your operation. And that might change over time. And you can't rest on your laurels and just say, oh, we did this like this way 10 years ago, because it could change and evolve as you move forward. So we are very lucky this month. We have Jeff. Jeff is our lender expert, and we're going to bring him in. He thinks about this a lot. He has a lot of experience working with growers to help them think about this. So he's going to share some of his observations and expertise. So Jeff, is there an example that you could share about how you've seen in your experience farms thinking about their allocating those fixed expenses and how it impacted their management decisions?
Well, I was working with a very hardworking family that had a contract hog feeding operation. They had a custom feeding cattle operation. They had about 800 to 1,000 acres of row crop. And then they also did some custom combining for their neighbor. Very hardworking operation. They just didn't feel like they were making enough money, and worked with them to break down their enterprises. They did not have any enterprise records.
What were the costs that you helped them allocate, and what are some of the outcomes from that activity?
Well, for example, the LP tank was shared by the grain drying setup and the hog building. The fuel barrel was being used for the grow crop, as well as fueling the tractor on the feed wagon, the manure spreader, the skid loaders, as well as the row crop. The repair bills were just thrown in one bucket. They weren't allocated for which was custom farming or which was how much was being used to repair the skid loader, things like that. They were working hard, and they believed that they should be making money, but their earnings weren't there. And as we discovered it, they weren't allocating expenses toward the custom cattle feeding that was necessary to cover things like the round bales they were making. Just daily operational expenses just weren't getting covered. They were able to demonstrate to the owner of the livestock that they needed more yardage to cover their costs and also provide for their labor.
Right. So as a result of this, they made a pretty big change to their operation that actually helped them get more profitable.
Yes.
Good.
Jeff, that's a great example, right? They were working hard. They had a lot of diversity in the types of their enterprises, and the temptation would have been, we should just work harder, right? And they might have added more livestock to this custom feeding, and without that knowledge, without that information, they could just be, working harder and not earning enough still. They could have been adding to the problem instead of actually, improving their own situation. So that's a really great example. Appreciate you sharing that. One of the things that I hear a lot from producers is when they think about allocating their fixed expenses, they say, oh, I have a software that helps me with that. And then they just sort of move on. They don't really share much more. What do you think about that? And how do you think about software and how about this allocation process?
I believe they should just keep it simple. Just a log, a notebook, keeping track of the fuel, their labor, their hours they put into that enterprise and evaluate their expenses that way.
The old flip notebook, right? You put in your shirt pocket. Sometimes it's valuable to get started with something simple.
Yeah, I think we sometimes we underestimate the value of simplicity, and we can use tools that kind of do all this allocation for us in kind of a behind the scenes way. But sometimes if we don't really understand it, it may not be the way that makes the most sense for our situation at hand. And I think that's really important, because as a farm wants to grow, if you grow and then lever yourself in an enterprise where you didn't really have the costs allocated correctly, it can lead to some problems, right?
So Jeff, you mentioned the notebook, right? Are there any other best practices that you've observed over time that you've seen producers use that have made a big impact for them?
Just understand your cost. Just understand what you're providing as far as labor, repairs to that enterprise.
So do you have any examples of worst practices, right? Things that really get us in trouble if we pursue this path, things that might really get us into trouble?
Well, go back to your example where you allocated all the expenses to the row crop because $16 an acre was not too bad, but you expand the cow herd and now all of a sudden your expenses associated with the equipment, repairs, fuel, labor have all increased, and you don't understand why, because what was working was making me money, but actually the cow herd may have been losing money and bleeding, causing some bleeding in the operation.
Yeah, we don't want to expand something that's bleeding, right? And that example that I shared is an example. If there's bleeding going on in that cow-calf scenario, if we expanded it, it would really exacerbate our situation pretty quickly for us. So I have one last question for you, Jeff. What's a piece of advice that you'd want to share with producers on a billboard where thousands of producers might see it as they're thinking about their plans here for February 2021?
Know your expenses.
It's a great piece of advice. Thank you so much, Jeff. Lots to think about.
We got a few questions in here, some good ones. One, this is, I think, one of the more important ones, is how do you account for managerial expense or time invested? And I think that's a question a lot of us struggle with. So first of all, we have to figure out, what the cost of that time is. And then I think we also have to think about where we're spending our time. And so, those are really important questions. We, as an economist, we always like to think about what your alternative is, right? So what's the other alternative that you could use your managerial time for? It might be getting a job somewhere else or whatever, but it's coming up with a reasonable charge for your management expense. And one of the ways I like to think about it, sometimes I like to calculate out kind of my returns and then look at it as okay, here's my return to the equipment that I have invested, the land that I have that if I didn't charge rent on it, and my time. And then you can kind of go back and start saying, okay, well, here's the return. I have a good idea of what this land might be worth what my alternative might be. So let's put a number on that. Let's put a number on the equipment, maybe what it's going to cost me to replace all of the equipment that I kind of used up during the course of a year, and see what that management return is. And is that a number that I want to work for or not? And so it's just a way to kind of back into some of those things and get yourself a return that you're comfortable with. Because if we don't budget, it's like we always say, if you don't budget for your land expenses, even if you own the land, it's paid for, you don't budget for it, it's hard to make sure you're getting prices that give you the kind of return you want. So I want to do the same thing with managerial time as well. And then the other thing I think that is really important is to think about, how are you spending your time? Where some of that time is labor, some of that time is management time, and how are you spending your time? Because a lot of times, and I'm a classic example of this, I I get misallocate some of that managerial time a lot to do things that I probably shouldn't be doing when there's probably a higher return doing some other things. So I think that's what, the first step is to figure out where you're spending your time.
I want to echo some of the points you mentioned, is that separate labor and sort of managerial, right? And sometimes we love to do so, right? So I grew up in Southeast Kansas, and some folks down there just love to feed cows. That's kind of feed cows in the winter. It's kind of a hobby, right? And it's not, it's kind of what they're doing. So that might be a different, activity for them. But I think at the end of the day, you really need to think about where you're spending your time, because you might find out in some reflection that you're spending a whole lot of time on maybe this cattle feeding operation, and it takes a lot of your time and your managerial and your frustrations, and you're just not getting a lot of return there. I think that's where you need to start to zero in and make those tough management decisions, is make sure you're spending your time where you're getting those returns to management.
Yeah, and David, I don't think David's throwing shade on, say, cattle. It could be the crop operation. I mean, right. It's just really stopping and keeping track of that is an important thing. But honestly, if we don't budget for it, I don't think we'll expect to earn it over a long period of time, because we tend to start to go, oh, well, that was good enough. And if we're not budgeting for it, it's the same thing with equipment. You don't budget for that equipment replacement that the equipment you've used up. What'll tend to happen is we'll farm, and then come time to replace equipment, and we just won't have the funds to do it because we haven't really budgeted for it over time. I just think it's really, really important. Another question: how do I determine if I no longer need a tractor or other machinery by hours used? What if it's paid off? And so, this is another good question. It gets at a concept, I think, that David and I were talking about just offline the other day, of the value of slack versus efficiency. And by what we mean by that is, and what brought it up was the discussion of the utility failure in Texas. Okay, and so part of what happened there is they had optimized their system to run very efficiently for a given set of conditions that didn't involve really cold temperatures. And so they were really, really efficient in that situation. Now, if it got really cold, things weren't going to work well, but it didn't happen very often. So did you really want to make an investment to winterize, say, your power plant or your gas handling equipment so that it could handle that? Well, a lot of years it wouldn't pay off at all, right? In fact, it'd be extra cost, and so you wouldn't be as efficient. But then when the bad time comes, the whole system kind of breaks down. So I think a lot of us are always battling that issue of cost, slack and efficiency, and equipment is a big one. Like if you go out to most farms, you look around, you see equipment that may not be used very often, or maybe is not being used to its fullest capacity. So it's a really tough question. Well, why would farmers do that? A classic example would be planting capacity. Maybe we've got enough plant capacity in most years we'll be done planting really, really early. So there might be a tendency to say, wow, man, I could probably get more efficient, get rid of one of those planters and just get one bigger planter and plant it all. And that'll work most of the time until that year comes when that extra capacity would have been really important. And that's a trade-off we all have to make. So I think that's one of the things to think about is, how much extra do we have currently? And could we get rid of it and never miss it? So that's one way to think about it. And maybe the question you're asking is, well, I've got this tractor paid off and it's sitting here on my farm. It isn't costing me anything anymore. And that's probably true to the extent that it may not depreciate a lot at this point anymore. But you also have to ask yourself what is the value of that? What could I do with that money, with those resources, if I were to sell that tractor? Is there something else, someplace else I could put that money that gives me a much better return? And that's the way I would encourage you to think about it. What could that tractor be for me that, it's sitting there as a tractor, I'm not using it very much, it's paid off, yeah, but what else could that tractor be for me? I mean, what else could I do with it?
So Brent, using your example, the extremes will get you in trouble in both ways, right? If you optimize to the bare minimum amount of equipment that you need, you're going to run into troubles in those tough planting or harvest condition years, right? And all the neighbors are going to remember that year that you didn't get all your crop planted or you didn't get it all harvested before Christmas. At least in Eastern Kansas, did they get their beans harvested before Thanksgiving? That's always the metric, right? But on the other end, we all know the story of too much equipment, right? And they have too many combines, too many planters, too many pieces of tractor. And there's, to Brent's point, there's either it's going to cost you more money than you can afford or justify, or there's better ways that you could be using those assets. And so I guess it's a hard question, and it's part of it's going to be on personal preferences, and part of it's going to be, how you think about those risks and other ways that you think about building in resilience in your system to deal with those adverse outcomes or those unexpected outcomes.
And David, I think that's another good point. It made me think of something else. Sometimes we talk ourselves into thinking we don't really push our logic as much as we could, because somebody say, well, yeah, I need that tractor because if X, Y, Z happened, I could get it. Sometimes we have to ask ourselves, well, maybe if that situation arises, is there another alternative that we could go to that would solve the problem for a lot less cost too? And that might exist too. Maybe we could custom hire some of it or whatever it might be. So there's no pat answer, I guess, is what Dave and I are saying.
That'll do it for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender. Thank you, Brent, David, and Jeff, for leading today's conversation. And for you in the audience, thanks for joining us. Look forward to seeing you on a line again next month.